One of the mind-blowing things that many people, including myself, have learned from your work is that these diseases, like Alzheimer's and dementia, are not something that we one day just wake up with, that all of a sudden we're okay, and then one day we're not. In fact, for the vast majority of people, their diagnosis was years and often decades in the making. So I'd love to start there. What are some of the earliest warning signs, well before these diseases develop, that someone is on their way to developing them?
Let me first say that your risk of becoming an Alzheimer's individual if you reach 85 years of age is 50-50. So we're talking about an awful lot of people. And for younger people who want to know, are there issues that might be indicative of increased risk at this stage of my life, when I'm 30, when I'm 40? There are, and these are actually very straightforward metrics, and they can be determined with, for example, a tape measure around your belly, or your blood sugar, or your blood pressure, or your level of physical activity. With those four issues being brought into line, I'll just step out here and indicate that you might be able to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's by around 70%.
Wow.
Yeah. And what you said actually is true and really important, and that is that the seeds of Alzheimer's are sown 20 to 30 years prior to the clinical manifestations. The clinical manifestations being things like failing memory, poor judgment, difficulties with what we call executive function, putting together complex ideas to carry out an activity. We can actually determine that early on and predict who is going to end up with Alzheimer's by looking at brain metabolism. We now have the ability to measure in real time how is the brain using glucose. And you can see early on, prior to any clinical manifestation, as much as 2 decades or 3 decades ahead of time, that there are areas of the brain, important areas, the temporal parietal area, areas like the hippocampus, for example, that demonstrate deficiencies or lower levels of metabolism. So metabolism is the delivery of blood and the utilization of fuel. And in this case, we're talking basically about glucose. And you can see in these brain scans that people may have issues with that early in life, to the extent that the brain is going to fail. The brain is highly active from a metabolic perspective. At rest, your brain is consuming about a quarter of all your body's energy utilization at any given time, while it only occupies about 3 to 4% of your body weight. So it's really power hungry, as you would expect, as computers are, right? But it's when the abilities of the brain to metabolize, to use fuel, begin to become compromised, that cells become less functional. Not that they necessarily die. You know, we used to look at these scans and say, oh, these are neurons that are no longer functioning. Well, they're functional and not functioning. They could be brought back online, for example, by utilizing an alternative fuel source for the brain, like ketones, for example. We see that in these individuals who show deficiencies of brain metabolism as it relates to the primary fuel called glucose, that when they are provided ketones, that those areas actually work. And in fact, some research has actually demonstrated in full-blown Alzheimer's improvement in cognitive function by utilization of a ketogenic diet. Who knew? But having said that, if we're talking about metabolism, then we are talking about the incredibly important role of our lifestyle choices when we are younger. That the biggest threats to our metabolism are the development of prediabetes or full-blown diabetes, obesity or overweight, and elevation of our blood pressure. These are things that are demonstrative of deficient or compromised metabolism. The brain just can't take it. You might think that, well, I'm a little overweight, my blood sugar is a little elevated, as is my blood pressure. Things that you should know. You're not going to know unless they're measured. But the brain is already suffering and is already beginning to decline. So you are correct that by the time people begin to demonstrate obvious issues with their cognitive function, this process has been going on for decades. And so our mission is really to intervene when people are healthy. As John Kennedy said, the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. Or as Desmond Tutu said, while it's important to take people out of the river, we need to find out why they're falling in the first place, keep them from falling in. That's really the mission, is prevention of this disease, which is at hand today.
You know, you have a great quote that you've shared before. Most people ignore their brain until it's too late. And today's conversation is reminding people that, yes, if you're in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, it's not too late. But also, if you're in your 50s, your 60s, your 70s, as long as you can actually have agency over your lifestyle, which we're going to get into, the things that you can actually influence today, then you can make changes at any stage that positively impact the brain. Is that a fair statement to say?
It is. It's breathtakingly fair, yes. And you know, the sad commentary is that we live in Western society with the notion that we can pretty much live our lives however we choose, and when there's a problem, modern medicine is going to come along and fix it for us. Well, you know, the idea that we can fix so many of our maladies, I think, is off base. We don't have any treatment for diabetes. There's no pharmaceutical treatment for diabetes whatsoever. There are certainly medications that will bring your blood sugar down, that's for sure. But when you stop taking those medications, your blood sugar goes right back up because your diabetes hasn't been treated. You still have it. You still have your high blood pressure. It goes right back up when you stop the medication. So the medicines that we have at our disposal are treating the smoke and ignoring the underlying problem. They're ignoring the fire. And when we discuss Alzheimer's, we actually don't have anything to even treat the symptoms these days to improve the memory, improve the cognition. We heard in the spring of last year, wonderful announcements that Alzheimer's treatment had reached a new threshold, that suddenly it's been a game changer with drugs that were designed to rid the brain of this terrible protein called beta amyloid. And the reality was that these drugs, three of which, at least two that were popularized, were absolutely demonstrated to lower that sticky protein in the brain. No question, they worked in terms of either keeping that amyloid from being produced or actually using what are called monoclonal antibodies to rid the brain of beta amyloid in comparison to placebo. But what didn't happen was there wasn't really any change in cognitive decline, especially by the time, these were 18-month studies, by the time you got to the 15th month, both the treatment and the placebo groups in these wonder drugs fell off a cliff. So, in fact, one very, very well-publicized drug called Aduhelm was taken off the market about 2 weeks ago, and by its manufacturer Biogen. They finally said, look, it's not working. The other thing that we've noticed, and this is, I think, very important for your audience to embrace, is that we need to practice medicine under the doctrine of primum non nocere. Above all, do no harm. And what didn't receive much publication was the fact that these drugs were associated with significant issues. One classification is called amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, or ARIAs. And these are areas in the brain that they were blaming on the amyloid, therefore we got to get rid of it, areas of the brain of swelling and hemorrhage. And these were seen in over 20% of the treatment groups and less than around 4% of the placebo groups. This is brain hemorrhage that we didn't talk about. And the other thing that's really interesting to note, and that is that a group in Australia got access to the data from these research studies and looked at specifically the MRI scans that were done in a serial fashion throughout the 18-month study. And suddenly they were surprised to note that in comparing those who received the medications versus those who had not, that there was a dramatic shrinkage in the brains of people who were given the drugs, to the extent that their Alzheimer's was significantly further along the continuum in terms of brain shrinkage than one would expect, and then in comparison to the placebo group. So, this notion that Alzheimer's is caused by beta amyloid, take the amyloid away, problem solved, didn't pan out. We're not there. One new drug was announced in November of 2023, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Two different independent studies revealed dramatic reduction in the beta amyloid, zero change in comparison of placebo to treatment group. in terms of cognitive decline. So we've got to look elsewhere. And, an interesting study was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2020 saying that basically entitled along the lines of, in Alzheimer's, the spotlight moves to metabolism. So again, we're back to this notion that the metabolic issues of the brain, how it utilizes fuel, is really front and center in terms of what leads to Alzheimer's. And purposes of our discussion today, what can we do to prevent it? And where we're going to go later in our discussion today is, what about novel ideas targeting metabolism to actually treat this problem?
Fantastic. Well, you mentioned 4 things at the beginning and the opening of this podcast that sound so simple, but are worth just touching on for a minute when it comes to identifying our risk in developing these neurodegenerative conditions. The first one was incredibly simple, and most people listening today probably have it at home, and it was a tape measure. What does a tape measure have to do with us understanding how well our body, and therefore our brain are running or not running?
Very simple. Increased body fat around the belly, around the middle, is a marker of metabolic dysfunction. It's correlated with higher markers of inflammation, increased resistance of the body's ability to use insulin, higher blood sugar, increased action of damaging free radicals. There it is, just a measurement of your belly. So, what could be more simple? And then I did describe, various other perhaps more sophisticated ways of looking at your metabolism. But that's a good place to start, and get your blood pressure checked, for example. That's pretty straightforward. If we want to take it further, then by all means, get a sense as to what is your fasting blood sugar. And if you really want to be, aggressive and get the most out of that data, then try wearing a continuous glucose monitor for a couple of weeks and get a sense not only what your blood sugar was on a particular morning, but what is it throughout the day? What is it in terms of its average? How do you respond to carbohydrates in your meal? What is the maximum blood sugar that you might experience in a day, which you're not going to know if you go to the doctor every year and have a fasting blood sugar that people actually train for. It's a much better understanding of the dynamics of sugar metabolism in your body. Nothing could be more important for your brain. In my opinion, that's probably the most important thing to consider as it relates to Alzheimer's risk. I wrote Grain Brain, and people kind of talked about the fact that, well, that's a book that talks all about gluten issues in how even in the brain, gluten sensitivity can affect the brain. Well, we did talk about gluten quite a bit, but the main issue with respect to the grains was the processed grains raising blood sugar, and the relationship, even when I wrote that book in 2012, the relationship of markers of blood sugar to the risk of developing either brain shrinkage or actual Alzheimer's or even cognitive decline. And that information was published even back then. I quoted a study from, I believe the author was named Sechi, in the New England Journal of Medicine, who described a powerful relationship between average blood sugar measurement, which is called the hemoglobin A1C, and rate of brain shrinkage, a perfect correlation. Higher levels of A1C, faster rates of brain shrinkage. Couldn't be more simple than that. What was important was that these relationships began at an A1C of around 5.8, where a doctor is going to say, hey, you're doing great. You're not even pre-diabetic yet. And other studies, and also from the New England Journal of Medicine way back then, showing that having a blood sugar even 100 to 105, where you're going to get a pat on the back and be told, come back next year, associated with increased risk of developing dementia. So, we have to redefine, we have to get away from defining normal or in the normal range, which is, when you take 1,000 people, what's normal, basically what is average, to really focus on what is optimal, what's best for an individual. And I can assure you it's not having a blood sugar of 100 to 105. We now know quite clearly that's not good enough. You're not doing your job. That's a blood sugar unlike anything humans have experienced in their past, I would suspect.
Just to connect the dots even a little bit further off of what you shared, and again, I'm pulling a quote from you. If your blood glucose is high, right, you're on your way to pre-diabetes. We know that millions of people, I think the estimates are 80 million people in America are in that pre-diabetic range. Then you're well on your way at that point in time to, getting diabetes. And you share the statistic that if you have diabetes, you are 4xing your chances, quadrupling your chances of ultimately ending up with Alzheimer's. Is that accurate?
With ultimately ending up with a disease for which there is no pharmaceutical fix. You're paving the way to be stuck. And what a horrible disease. I mean, there are some innovative approaches to actually treating Alzheimer's. You're familiar with the work of Dr. Dale Bredesen, amazing pioneering work, but it's not one thing that he does. It's a multitude of what he calls holes in the roof that he plugs to keep it from raining in. But the idea that, there's a drug out there right now that's going to turn a person around, that's not reality. We're nowhere near that. Though I do have some ideas that we'll talk about later that may open the door to that type of approach.
Well, we talked about the tape measure, and by proxy, essentially an at-home ability to look at just how much excess weight is your body carrying around and storing. If you can go a step further, people can get an in-body scan or a DEXA scan. They can get a body composition of themselves. These days, there's also even a step further. You have a lot of imaging centers that are looking at also visceral fat as a byproduct of, the most dangerous type of fat inside of the, body that would also be increasing our risk of a lot of these metabolism or actually a byproduct of the fact that we have such bad and poor metabolic health. You talked about blood sugar in detail, the importance of not just relying on a fasting glucose, but potentially if you can afford it, or you can convince your doctor using something like a continuous glucose monitor, or trying one of these, direct to consumer solutions that are there. And that how blood sugar is largely in this elevated state for so many millions of people because they are consuming, first and foremost, a lot of ultra processed calories from both sugar and refined carbohydrates. Carbohydrates can be good. We don't want to demonize them, but we're talking about the refined excess levels of carbohydrates in the diet. What are some examples of those, just so people can connect the dots?
Well, basically, pretty much anything in a package. Any carbohydrate in a package, whether they're derived from grain or other type of carbohydrate that's been modified in such a way that when we consume them, we are basically consuming sugar. So the pastas, the refined rices, the crackers, cookies, cakes, anything from flour, even if it's organic, organic flour that was made and blessed by elves, it doesn't matter. It's going to raise your blood sugar. But the point is that I'll say it's likely to raise your blood sugar. It's really valuable to know what, in terms of an individual, is going to raise his or her blood sugar. So it's a bit of a personalized approach in terms of what we should be eating. And everybody's trying to talk about, this diet being the best diet, whether it's pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan, paleo, carnivore, or only eating foods that start with a vowel. Whatever it may be, the point is, for me, I've come to a place in life where my response is two things or three things. I want to see a diet that's got a lot of fiber of color, meaning lots of colorful vegetables, and a diet that keeps your blood sugar under control. If you can do those two things, I don't care. I'm fine, because you're going to get your nutrients, you're going to have fiber to nurture your microbiome, and you're going to be on a program, whatever it may be for you, that keeps your blood sugar under control. And I want to comment, you said something earlier about if you can afford it, a CGM, continuous glucose monitor. If that's an issue, a simpler thing to do, not as effective, but very informative, the next time a person goes to the doctor for that annual blood work, including the fasting blood sugar, make sure they do a fasting insulin level as well, because that's going to tell an individual where he or she is in terms of insulin functionality, insulin sensitivity, meaning that you might have a normal blood sugar, but it's only normal because your body is putting out a lot of insulin to keep that blood sugar where it needs to be. In other words, the pancreas is working overtime, and that is a bit of a harbinger for future insulin resistance, blood sugar then coming up and ultimately becoming pre-diabetic and diabetic. So it's a good test to have. Is it as effective as wearing a glucose monitor for a period of time? I don't think so. But still, it's something we could add to that list of potential studies we could get.
And one other thing that you mentioned was blood pressure. What is blood pressure? And, getting your regular blood pressure checked, where does that fall into and why is it considered a risk factor?
Well, blood pressure really relates to blood flow. And ultimately, the higher a blood pressure is, ultimately, the less blood flow we're going to get to our organs. And that's, the real issue with why even subtle elevations of blood pressure are risky, because of the associated risk with cardiovascular disease and stroke. So we want to keep our blood pressure low so that our blood vessels remain resilient and we can continue to supply blood to areas that are needed. And it's interesting that both blood pressure and function of insulin/glucose are regulated upstream by the same chemical, which is nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, yes, plays a role. It was the original vascular endothelial factor that was involved in allowing blood vessels to expand, to improve blood supply, blood flow when needed to various organs of the body. In fact, the Nobel Prize was awarded in 1988 because of that discovery, that it was a gas, nitric oxide, in the body. Who knew a gas would have such activity? But more recently, it's been discovered that this nitric oxide gas actually plays a fundamental role in regulating how insulin works in the body. The functionality of insulin is dependent to a significant degree on the presence of nitric oxide. So that said, we lose nitric oxide as we age. Our nitric oxide levels decline in lockstep with various changes that occur in the mouth, for example, with respect to the mouth organisms, the bacteria living in the mouth, the oral microbiome, if you will. Who knew that about 50% of the nitric oxide in our bodies is a consequence of what bacteria on the top of the tongue are able to do with the food that we eat. When we eat colorful vegetables like beets that are high in nitrates, those nitrates are converted into nitrite in the bacteria by virtue of the bacteria that live on the back of the tongue, the top of the tongue. And that nitrite is the raw material from which our bodies are able to manufacture this nitric oxide then in the rest of the body. So you can imagine if we were to damage those bacteria somehow in some crazy way, that perhaps their ability to ultimately allow us to have adequate amounts of nitric oxide might be compromised. And what might that do? Well, it might affect blood pressure, it might affect blood sugar. Well, it turns out that this was studied back in 2019. Two studies demonstrated that when people use mouthwash that is antibacterial 2 or more times a day, a 3-year study, it was demonstrated that there was about a 49% increased risk of becoming a diabetic when you used a mouthwash 2 or more times a day over a 3-year period. Risk of being diagnosed with hypertension increased close to 100%. And what are you doing? You're killing off bacteria that are there to help you and make nitric oxide available in your body to control your blood sugar, to control blood supply to your organs. So, now we've talked for an awful long time about the value and the importance of our gut microbiome. Now we're talking about the mouth microbiome and the importance of these bacteria and the fallacy of us being told to use this mouthwash because it kills 99.9% of germs. They're not germs, if germs are pejorative. They're bacteria that we have co-evolved with for tens of thousands of years that are now have had their functionality delineated such that those bacteria, when you connect the dots, are controlling our blood sugar and blood pressure. Who knew?
Who knew? So quick recommendations. If somebody's using mouthwash out there today, chuck it in the trash, give it away, donate it, whatever you want to do. You've done some episodes with some great people in the space, like Dr. Mark Verhana, who's a great educator. Your recommendations for just solid oral health, which also, maintaining good oral health and reducing the risk of things like gingivitis, coming later on in life, also is supportive for avoiding these neurodegenerative diseases as well. Is that correct? I have to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, AG1, a product that I've literally been taking for years. AG1 is a daily foundational nutritional supplement that supports whole body health. I take it every single morning. It features 75 vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and whole food sourced ingredients. So I know I'm getting an extra dose of beneficial nutrients in addition to the food that I'm eating. This supplement supports healthy aging because it includes all the incredible benefits that many of the experts that you've seen on my show talk about. And the best part about it is it's so easy to take. Just take a scoop of AG1, throw it in cold water or add it to your shaker bottle, and that's literally it. Drink it up. Right now, my community can try AG1 if you head to the link in the description below. And the best part, you'll get a free 1-year supply of AG1's D3 vitamin K2 plus 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase of AG1. Just head over to drinkag1.com/Dhru. I know you're going to love AG1 as much as I do.
That's right. Well, let's first talk about Dr. Mark Verhana. So I have had him on my podcast, and that podcast on YouTube absolutely went viral. I mean, in the first couple of weeks, there were, I think, 800,000 views. Because he's an amazing speaker, he's incredibly knowledgeable, and this is a very, very important and not talked about topic that we need to nurture our oral microbiomes. And he made it very clear that fluoride-containing toothpaste, mouthwashes threaten the oral microbiome, and various things that we do threaten the oral microbiome. And what should we do? We should floss, we should brush, and use I guess it's a brand name. Sorry, Waterpick. Whatever. There's got to be a name for it. A water flosser of some sort. And in fact, I have a USB rechargeable one. I don't even know the brand, and I travel with it because I use it all the time. Dr. Verhana has developed a type of toothpaste that nurtures the oral microbiome. It's called FYGG, FYGG, which stands for your good guys. So he's trying to care and love the oral microbiome. And I think it's really very, very valuable. It's a new frontier. We hadn't considered that before, but look, 10 years ago when we talked about the gut-brain connection, people thought that I had a screw loose, and maybe I did, but now everybody seems to be talking about the gut-brain connection and the brain-gut connection as well. It's bidirectional. But that said, it's recognizing what you had mentioned, that poor oral health bodes poorly for the brain. Periodontal disease is clearly associated with cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative conditions as well. When there is an overgrowth of various types of bacteria, one in particular called Porphyromonas gingivalis, it's threatening to the brain. We can detect breakdown products of that bacterium in the brain and with inflammation around it. So, we're learning an awful lot these days about what goes on in one part of the body and how it affects the brain and other parts of the body.
Yeah, I love that. Also, I'm a big fan of FYGG. I use it every day. My wife loves it. I have no affiliation. I just thought they did an incredible job in making a better for you toothpaste that's out
and
there.
And I have no affiliation either, but shout out for FYGG, FYGG, because it's a good thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. We'll link it in the show notes if anybody wants to check it out. There was one other one that you mentioned, which was brain metabolism. And of course, that is, really the big picture conversation here. How does our brain use energy? But you mentioned something that was very curious to me. You said we have tools these days to actually kind of see how good our brain is at utilizing energy. What are some of those tools, and are they available to the people that are listening today?
First tool would be simply a neurocognitive test. If they're available, multiple sites have them online and they're free. I know that Dr. Bredesen's site has it. And that's going to give you an indication. If you're not up to speed based upon age adjustment, that's an indication that your brain metabolism is off. But there is the development now of a unique type of MRI scan, no radiation, that is going to be able to measure brain metabolism, being developed by Dr. Raj Attariwala in Vancouver. He pioneered total body MRI, which I just had, about 3 weeks ago. I traveled to Vancouver to spend some time with Dr. Attariwala to discuss the total body MRI and specifically the upcoming development of brain functional imaging as it relates to brain metabolism. So I think it's going to be something that will be available to people soon. The studies that I mentioned earlier that predict difficulties with the brain 2 decades ahead of time are really research study. They are using a radioactive tagged glucose called fluorodeoxyglucose. These are really just designed for research application, unfortunately. But, again, it is a radioactive tracer, so it wouldn't be fully considered non-invasive. But I think the MRI scans that Dr. Attariwala is developing are going to be available probably, throughout North America. And I think it's going to be, for those of us who are involved in research in this area, going to be very, very helpful.
Something you've been posting about as long as I can remember is really helping people understand the risks of a sedentary lifestyle as being another risk factor when it comes to the brain. When your body is sedentary and you don't get exercise, you in a way have a sluggish brain. And a sluggish brain is a brain that is at a much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's, dementia, other neurodegenerative diseases. Talk to us about exercise and how people can benchmark the level of exercise they're getting, or in some cases not getting at any age, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 and beyond, as a measure of what their likelihood is of developing a brain disease.
Well, it's been said that sitting is the new smoking. And, with all the things that we do, pretty much you could be sitting all day. And, the relationships between this sedentarity and risk of neurodegenerative conditions, I think, is really quite profound. But it's also cardiovascular issues, diabetes, obesity, it's hypertension. We have a very cush life now. We don't have to do anything. We have to, make ourselves get up and do things, unless you really find something that you really, really like and it's an impetus to stay active. For me, lately, it's been pickleball. Cats meow. Love the sport. Anyway, so one study published last year in the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at individuals over a long period of time and had them 8-year period of time, had them wear what's called a wrist accelerometer that measured their walking. And that's just one form of activity. And it strongly correlated increased number of steps per day with decreased risk of cognitive decline. Perfect correlation. They found that the ideal sweet spot was somewhere around 9,800 steps per day. So just around the so-called 10,000 steps per day. Another study that was published in the journal BMJ in January of 2023 was a 10-year study looking at, I believe, 80,000 individuals. And it looked at a variety of lifestyle metrics, including physical activity, socialization, in other words, interacting with other people, challenging oneself cognitively, cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, and nutrition. As all variables over which we have control. And what was really fascinating about the results was that where this is going. Those who had the most healthy lifestyle based upon the various parameters I just mentioned had a dramatically lower risk for cognitive decline. But here's the take-home message that I think is so profound. is that it included even, they teased apart those individuals who carried the APOE4 allele. In other words, the so-called Alzheimer's risk gene. The same results were seen in those individuals who heretofore were condemned to thinking that they were going to get Alzheimer's because they carried APOE4, which about 23% of Americans actually carry. It's a allele, it's a variable type of gene, if you will. You can have APO2, APO3, APO4, and you have 2 shots at it. So having 1 4 or 2 4s, we've always said, oh, that's a dramatic increased risk of Alzheimer's. This study showed that, guess what? If you maintain a healthy lifestyle, that despite carrying the APOE4 allele, healthy lifestyle offsets that risk and allows you to be in the group that's protected moving forward. So this information is absolutely profound, in my opinion, that here is this incredibly threatening disease affecting 55 million people worldwide, for which risk can be offloaded by simply making good choices today while you're cognitively intact. Again, fixing the roof while the sun is shining.
On that note, Dr. Perlmutter, why do you think, you've been doing this thing for a little while, even though you look super young. Why do you think that message still, with all the information that's out there, with so many people like yourself, especially championing this, why has that message not penetrated the zeitgeist to the degree that people who are so afraid of developing dementia in the future, Alzheimer's, any of these neurodegenerative diseases, they are not forming groups and societies where they're like, hey, let's regularly play pickleball for our brain health. Let's actually start making home cooked meals together in a group and be accountable to each other. Why is that not penetrated minus a small percentage of the population?
It's a great question. And here's a bit of cynicism. And that is that, what people generally pay attention to is what's fed to them and through media. And, all you have to do, if you want to answer your question, is watch the evening news tonight, or any night for that matter. And all you see are advertisements for this drug or that drug. And when the Alzheimer's drugs were first approved, that'd be another thing to talk about. Our medical journals were saturated with ads. In fact, I read another neurology journal last night, and on page 2 was an ad for one of these beta amyloid drugs, despite what I've just told you. So I think people are really receiving the message that our wonderful modern breakthroughs in science are here to fix all your ills. Enjoy the party. And it's just not that way. And I think people want to believe that they can get away with it all. And look at the soaring rates of diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. Those metrics are clear indicators that there's a storm on the horizon as it relates to Alzheimer's disease. And, the threat that isn't considered as it relates to Alzheimer's disease is that we're going to lose cognitive reserve as a society. We're losing all the smarts of elderly people, and frankly, not such elderly people. And that's worrisome, because there's great wisdom to be passed on from generation to generation. But having said that, again, the messaging is that there's going to be something developed very, very soon. Go ahead and continue to do what you want. Behave from the level of the amygdala. Eat what you want, act like you want, stay up late, watch TV, party like it's, there's no tomorrow. And there may not be if you continue to, make those lifestyle choices. It would be great. I would welcome a cure for this horrendous disease. It's been estimated by 2050, we'll have twice as many Alzheimer's patients in America. That's a horrendous increase. And the cost of just caring for these individuals right now is about $350 billion with a B a year just in our country alone. By 2050, that number is expected to be more than $1 trillion caring for Alzheimer's disease, a disease which is pretty much preventable if this message were to get out. So there's a week in May every year that is Alzheimer's Awareness Week. And we're all aware of Alzheimer's. What's the point to be aware of this so that we can have walks to raise money for development of drugs, or who knows where that money goes? So a bunch of us got together, people that you know, Rhonda Patrick, Dale Bredesen, Sarah Gottfried, myself, Jim Quick. A lot of people got together and said, we got to do better. So we've created on May the 15th, 2024. I know this is evergreen, sorry. Alzheimer's Prevention Day. And we're going to launch that globally. And this is going to be a web presence that gives people all of this information, interviews with thought leaders to give out this information like we're sharing right now, a robust resource as it relates to searchable publications that can confirm what we're talking about and give you chapter and verse how to do it, how to exercise, what kind of diet is best, how to measure blood sugar. All of these metrics will be made available to people to be really facilitated in terms of making important changes to protect your brain. We are the architects of our brain's destiny, not pharmaceutical companies. And that's the message that I think is so important. And I think gets to the heart of why you just asked me that question, because I think by and large, people and medical doctors think otherwise. There was an interesting report that appeared in Consumer Reports in the late 1980s by a Dr. Jerry Avorn from Harvard, who did a study asking doctors, where do you get the most information when you read a medical journal? And most of the information, more than 70%, came from the ads. So ads direct to medical doctors are very, very powerful and help dictate how they practice medicine. And truthfully, it is a lot easier and quicker to write a prescription than it is to talk to an individual about the various lifestyle choices that she or he should be making in order to safeguard their brains moving forward.
Such an important point. And, one of our friends recently, Callie Means, I don't know if you're connected with Callie, incredible guy.
Interviewing Callie in next week.
Yeah. So he's been all over X.com, formerly known as Twitter, really helping sound the alarm and piggybacking off of the statement that you just shared, reminding people that the primary reason that pharmaceuticals sponsor, the nightly news and pretty much everything that we watch, it isn't to necessarily market to all of us because we can't always remember which drug is what, but it's basically to control the conversation, because if you can influence the individuals who are writing about things, and if you are 30, 40, 50, up to 70% of all the ads that are there on TV, especially, then who's going to come after you or threaten your position? And it's something that the American public in particular, because it's so egregious here, they're waking up to, and there's starting to be a very strong revolt that we all feel like we've been manipulated in a way. And that's a good thing. It's okay to get angry. We just don't want to stay there. Now that has to lead to action and change.
I think, to be fair, people should hear both sides of the discussion, not only one side. And that's why over the years I've commended you for your podcast, because that's exactly what you're doing. And a lot of times you're not actually taking sides. You're just allowing the other side to be aired, if you will. And, I also want to say that I'm not anti-drug. If there is the development of a pharmaceutical product that can do good things, I'm all in. Count me in. We've got to look at the risk-benefit ratio, and we've got to make sure that we're not harming people. Above all, do no harm. And when drugs are developed that can accomplish those tasks, I'm supportive. I think that I wouldn't turn my back. That's not part of the oath I take. And I want to use as many tools in the toolbox as possible. And my mission is just to keep that toolbox filled with new and exciting developments. People have said, well, gosh, it sounds like you really want to function out of the box. And that's not my mission at all. My mission is to make the box bigger and be inclusive as it relates to novel ideas, and no matter what area of health we're talking about, or disease for that matter.
That's a great statement. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. Speaking of the tools of the toolbox, right? There's these incredible points that you've mentioned about being proactive with our body composition, making sure we're not walking around with so much weight, getting our blood sugar in check by not having, refined carbohydrates in particular and processed, ultra processed calories, sugar as well, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's nothing wrong with having some oatmeal here and there and having some almond butter and other things. There's plenty of ways to make a lot of foods that are out there in a healthy way. It's when they become the complete opposite of healthy and they become the base of our diet that people, suffer. In addition to that, you had a fantastic post that I just share here really quickly, just to kind of, recap with the audience. This is a post that you had on Instagram, including some of the other factors that we didn't mention. So being overweight before the age of 65, not engaging in regular exercise. You talked about that. Smoking tobacco for our audience. Hopefully that's a given. Would you put other things inside of that category of smoking? If people are smoking marijuana or anything else, I don't partake in that, but is that a risk factor?
Yeah, it is. I mean, oddly enough, I interviewed today Dr. David Rabin, and he has a company called Apollo. It's a wearable, but he's a MD, PhD psychiatrist. And he was actually talking about some therapeutic benefits in certain clinical situations of cannabis. And, I can understand there may be some application there, but aside from the neuroactive components, you're inhaling heated chemicals, which can be damaging to you. I think I can't see a role for smoking anything, frankly.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. Becoming a type 2 diabetic, we talked about that. And this is one that I'd love to just touch on for a moment. Not engaging in mentally stimulating activities like reading, playing chess, etc. We went through this massive wave of Sudoku, and everybody thought that that's the thing that's going to keep your brain healthy. So anywhere I would fly all the time, you saw individuals doing puzzles on the plane, thinking that that was going to be the primary way to make sure that they kept stimulating their brain and hopefully lowering their risk of developing a neurodegenerative disease. Nothing against Sudoku, but why is that maybe not the full story? Why do we need something a little bit more challenging and a variety of things that are challenging?
Yeah, let's we'll go to the variety in just a moment. But the first requirement is that there has to be some way of evaluating what the activity did. Let me give you an example. I had a patient, actually her husband said that she's doing everything she can and to keep her brain healthy. And he said she reads the New York Times cover to cover every single day. And in front of her. And I said, "Oh, what was the headline today?" No idea. So it's all well and good to say I do this and then the other, but it has to be validated that you've actually engaged with that subject. I learned a new song on the guitar today. Okay, can you play it for me? Oh, well, maybe not. So you've got to have some reference point completing the puzzle or playing against another person, chess, so that you're constantly engaged in evaluating yourself and holding basically your feet to the fire. So to get to the variety, you want to recruit different parts of your brain in terms of different levels of functionality. And there needs to be, in my opinion, a physical activity involving, it would be a great thing to get involved, like learning to dance, learning ballroom dancing, playing a competitive sport, because then you're getting, this is happening at a time when you're creating chemicals for your brain like BDNF to really take full advantage of the fact you're trying to learn new information. So I think that's important, but also various types of stimuli, whether it's auditory or visual or tactile or even smell, as in learning to cook, learning to create things in the kitchen, or who knows, other things that you might, maybe you're going to mix essential oils. But all of these ways are going to enhance the functional connectivity of the brain. That's really very, very important, because that's what starts to go as we begin to decline. Yes, there are disruptions at the synapse level too, but there are levels at the network. There's dysfunction at the network level as well. The functional connectivity between areas of the brain ultimately suffers as our brain function declines. So it's the integration of the various areas of the brain that happens when we engage in a variety of different activities that we need to preserve. It's been said that neurons that fire together wire together. And what Dr. Hebb was getting at, Canadian researcher in the 1950s, was that, late 1940s actually, was that when we do things, ultimately, the more we do them, ultimately it makes those connections more indelible or more permanent, if you will. But we want to do that across multiple areas of input to activate different areas of the brain to keep a lot of cohesion going.
One area that we hadn't touched on, but is part of your framework when it comes to maximizing our brain's health, especially over the years, and that's the topic of sleep. For a long time, people didn't talk about sleep. And then I finally feel like in the last maybe 5 years or so, it's been getting a lot more attention, as it well deserves. What do you want to tell people about the topic of sleep as it's connected to dementia, Alzheimer's, and these neurodegenerative conditions?
So whatever we choose to do is going to have a powerful influence on our health. This is an activity that should be something we do for a third of our lives. That 8 hours a day, 1/3 of the 24-hour period, is dedicated to this activity. It's not like we exercise 8 hours a day, and not like we eat for 8 hours a day, although, I'm sure some people might do that. But, this is a profound activity. And as it relates to the brain, it's a very active event. It's when the brain is doing some very, very important things that are required for that brain to survive. It's when the brain is able to purify itself, rid itself of defective components, rid itself of misfolded proteins, debris from bacteria, you name it, during sleep, particularly during deep sleep, when we activate a system called the lymphatic system. It's when we contextualize, pack away, and consolidate our experiences of the day. Those experiences are related to previous experiences that are packed away in areas of the brain of memory, and then those new experiences are related to past experiences and then stored. So a lot is going on. The brain doesn't necessarily itself shut down. Our physical body doesn't move because of the brain tells it not to. We inhibit downward moving signals from the brainstem that would otherwise have moved our arms and legs. We dramatically inhibit that at the moment we fall asleep. And then the brain becomes very active. And as you would expect, any factory that's working as hard as the brain does in relation to other factories, the brain is far more metabolically active than anything else in your body. And it accumulates a lot of debris during the course of the day that needs to be dealt with. So it's fundamental. When we have either issues with quality or quantity of our sleep, we dramatically increase our risk for metabolic issues like diabetes, obesity, and hypertension, and senile dementia of the Alzheimer's type, i.e. Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease as well. But a powerful risk factor for the development of Alzheimer's is not getting enough quality sleep. How would you know? You would know because you use a wearable device of one sort or another, whether it's the Oura Ring or other wearable device that will tell you the very next morning how much sleep did you get, how long did it take you to fall asleep, how many times did you wake up, how much time did you spend in that deep sleep where that lymphatic system is active, how much time did you spend in REM sleep when you consolidate and contextualize your memories. These are good metrics to know. Why? Because you can change things during the day and at evening before you go to sleep that can have a huge bearing on the quality and quantity of your sleep. Whether it's deciding to have a caffeine curfew at 2:00 in the afternoon, meaning no coffee after 2 or caffeine of any sort, choosing the time of day that you want to exercise, whether it's morning or evening, depends on the individual. How late did you have your meal? How much carb was in your meal? Did you have, a dessert and high sugar, and now your body's trying to deal with that while you're trying to fall asleep? Is the room dark? Is it cooler than you might be comfortable with at first? Does your partner snore? Does your partner have restless leg syndrome? Is there noise outside that may, compromise your sleep? What time did you go to sleep in relation to the time that you think you're going to wake up? These are all variables over which you have control that you can determine that may or may not affect the quality and quantity of your sleep. There was a period of time when I wasn't happy with the amount of deep sleep that I was getting on rare occasion. And I'd look at my report the next day and it would say, hey, you only got 30 minutes of deep sleep. And I would say, I can do better than that. And I realized that on that night, that evening, that I didn't get enough deep sleep, it was that I had that second glass of wine. So make a simple behavioral shift. If I don't have a second glass of wine, if I have a glass of wine, I can get away with it. I have plenty of deep sleep. But that second glass just doesn't work for me. Though there are upsides to wine, I get all that. I don't do that because I need my deep sleep at my age with a family history of Alzheimer's, frankly. So it might be other things for other people. They may do better by exercising in the afternoon or in the morning, or by having a smaller dinner and eating a bigger breakfast. Who knows? But you're never going to know until you gain the data. You're not going to gain the data until you decide to wear a wearable device and find out what in the heck is going on in the background.
Fantastic. Going back to this idea of tools in the toolbox, Dr. Perlmutter, you talk about how lifestyle is first and foremost, and a lot of those things are free and easy tools that we have available to us. Exercise, our dietary choices that are there, the community that we spend time with, doubling down on sleep, challenging our brain by being novel and doing things that we can kind of measure. And then once we have those basics, which you've covered many of them here, now we can look at, the additional things that we can begin to do that can also be supportive. Again, these are all tools in the toolbox. And on those topics of tools, you've mentioned and you've written about how many supplements have shown demonstrated ability to be part of a healthy brain protocol and hopefully reduce our risk of developing some of these neurodegenerative diseases in the future. And one in particular that you've been championing for a long time is DHA, and as a byproduct, of course, fish oil supplements as a whole. Tell us why they're so important to the brain and why you're such a big fan of people getting adequate amounts.
Well, this goes back many years when I was first impressed with the work of a Dr. Martha Claire Morris at Rush, who demonstrated that people who have higher DHA seem to be more resistant to cognitive decline. And so, gosh, this was maybe 15 years ago. When I saw that literature, I began to ask myself, what does DHA do? Why might it be important? It turns out that it's a really important from the perspective of being a building block of brain cell membranes. So, the membrane is where all the action is where brain cells sense things that are around them. It's what, how they are signaled, where the receptors are that change what goes on inside the neuron, but also how one brain cell connects to the next brain cell through the synapse. That takes place at the level of this, what we call a synaptic cleft, where there's a giver and a receiver, but the membranes that are involved in that have a lot of DHA in them. And, basically we're going to build those membranes based upon the fats that are available in our bodies. If we don't have adequate amounts of DHA, then we're going to use other fats that are going to be less functional. So from just the mechanics of how the brain works, it started to make sense that DHA seemed to be pretty important. That's why early on I began incorporating DHA into my protocols. We then learned that DHA is a natural, what we call COX-2 inhibitor, cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitor. And cyclooxygenase is an enzyme that increases inflammation. There were a bunch of drugs that were developed that were COX-2 inhibitors to reduce inflammation. Even aspirin to some degree works as a COX-2 inhibitor. But DHA is nature's COX-2 inhibitor, so it tends to tamp down inflammation throughout the body, and that would be certainly valuable in the brain. But perhaps one of the biggest pluses of DHA is that it stimulates the body to produce something called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a growth and trophic hormone for brain cells. It stimulates the growth of new brain cells. It protects existing brain cells. It reduces the destruction of brain cells, and it nurtures the synapse, where one brain cell connects to the next, which is certainly something at threat when we consider neurodegenerative conditions. As again, Dr. Bredesen has talked about, Alzheimer's is a synaptoclastic disease, he says, meaning that the synapses are being destroyed, and that's one of the fundamental mechanisms. So it's really valuable to have a lot of DHA on board. It's why fish has been always called a brain food. These days, unfortunately, a lot of the fish that is available would be contaminated. More than 90% of freshwater fish in America now is significantly contaminated with a variety of chemicals, not the least of which are these PFAS chemicals, or these persistent forever chemicals, if you will. So, my vote is that wild fish, if you can find them, are still the best choice. Farm-raised salmon, depending on where it comes from. Norway, I think, is still pretty good at raising farm-raised salmon with very little contamination and pretty good levels of DHA. That said, there are some really high-quality DHA oil products available on the market. Several brands are out there that are really very, very clean. And there's even a vegetarian type of DHA that's made from algae. So I think you got to do your best to get a lot of DHA into your diet. 100 to 150 milligrams a day of DHA, I think, is reasonable. In people who are already suffering with cognitive issues, I use a lot more, recommend a lot more. But that's really, beyond the lifestyle factors, I think that's really, as we start to get into supplements, one of the on the top of the list.
Just to clarify that, I've seen you write different posts and communication that 1 gram of DHA would be optimal. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about the getting by. If people are using if they're just looking at a wide program, that 100 to 150 milligrams would be at the least what you want to consume, in looking at both your supplement and how much DHA you might get from fish. But I will push it, 500 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams easily, and not be concerned about it. Now, there's been some discussion that more so for the EPA that there might be some issues with respect to blood thinning, and frankly, DHA, no matter even at high levels, doesn't seem to have an interaction with blood thinners or put people at risk for hemorrhage. So I have no problem with going to higher levels.
Is it fair to say, just to put a button on the fish oil conversation, would you say that when it comes to supplementation and people thinking about there's only so much that you can do, there's only so much that you can prioritize, people are trying to get their workout in, etc., other things. And we as human beings tend to like to, prioritize and compartmentalize to make sure that we get the best of the best. Would fish oil in particular, making sure we had the adequate amount of DHA, which is one part of a fish oil supplement, would that be your number one recommendation on the supplement side?
Yeah, it's hard to rank. It really depends on the individual. Would I say that DHA would be the number one recommendation for a person whose vitamin D level was really, really low? No, I wouldn't. I'd say, let's get that vitamin D level up first. That's first and foremost. Would I say DHA is the go-to if a person has a very high homocysteine level? I'd say no. B complex with methylated B vitamins would be what is needed for that person. So it's a bit of a personalized medicine kind of a recommendation, but it's really very, very important. So, if I had to make a recommendation for just as a general recommendation, I'd probably agree with you that DHA would be at the top of that list.
Well, another one, it seems like you've also put into the top of the list. And again, this is all about personalization. So people got to dig in a little bit, maybe sometimes work with their practitioner. But you shared a post recently that my team had shared with me, and it was on the topic of glutathione. And even when I read it, I was pretty astonished by the post itself. It says, for those that are listening, researchers found that those with the lowest glutathione levels had a 70% increased risk for declined cognitive function.
That's right.
Talk to us about glutathione and why you believe it's so important. What does it do in the body? Why is it so important?
So glutathione has been called the master antioxidant. And as such, it's protective over DNA, over proteins and fat in terms of allowing them not to be as damaged by the production, the ubiquitous production in the body of free radicals, of damaging chemicals. So that's one of the jobs of glutathione. But in addition, glutathione through glutathione S-transferase is important in terms of detoxification as well. So it plays a fundamental role in helping us rid our bodies of many of the toxins to which we are exposed on a daily basis. So when we look at both antioxidant functionality and detoxification, those are really big threats to the body and to the brain. So it's not surprising then that having a lower level of glutathione is related to, as it were, cognitive decline, and even certainly Parkinson's as well. Now, this is data that we looked at many, many years ago, that Parkinson's patients have significantly lower levels of reduced glutathione. Should probably open that up in just a moment. And that led us to actually provide glutathione intravenously, reduced glutathione, to patients with Parkinson's. And what did we find? We found in some patients pretty remarkable improvements right away in their functionality. I think that the test that needs to be done is the administration of intravenous glutathione over a long period of time to chart the decline or cessation of decline in Parkinson's patients. But, we have to ask ourselves then, what can we do for maintaining our glutathione levels? And I would say that the ability for us to regenerate glutathione by taking a so-called glutathione supplement, I think, has not been adequately demonstrated as yet. I mean, there are a lot of products out there that are glutathione-based, whether they are liposomally encased or whatever, given orally. Turns out that glutathione, which is it's basically 3 amino acids put together, we call it a tripeptide, is pretty well broken down in the stomach and into the digestive system into those amino acids. What has been demonstrated to increase glutathione are a couple of supplements. One is called alpha lipoic acid, that regenerates glutathione from its oxidized or less valuable state to its reduced state, which means it can then participate as an antioxidant. N-acetylcysteine, or NAC, has also been demonstrated to improve glutathione levels. And frankly, we can improve glutathione levels by simply consuming higher amounts of cruciferous vegetables that are rich in sulfur. So there are ways of improving our glutathione status. The other thing that it should be considered is to offload the stress on glutathione in the human body and recognize that things that we might do that increase free radical production are going to consume glutathione in the body, and hence our levels of reduced glutathione are going to be less. We'll still have higher levels of oxidized or damaged glutathione. Glutathione exists in two forms. It's reduced form, which is the active form as it relates to free radicals. And when it quenches those free radicals, it sacrifices itself and becomes oxidized. So rather than oxidative damage to proteins, fat, or DNA in our bodies, glutathione sacrifices itself and says, I'll take the hit. I'll become oxidized. The good news is it can vacillate between oxidized form, damaged form, and being available again, the reduced form. And that's where these other ideas come into play, like alpha lipoic acid, in terms of allowing glutathione to become regenerated and become functional again. As such, looking at a blood test of total glutathione, since it measures both oxidized and reduced levels to make the total, doesn't really give you a sense as to where that individual is in terms of the functionality or the availability of glutathione to do its magic. You really want to look at the ratio of oxidized and reduced glutathione, and you want higher levels of reduced glutathione. And again, the ways to do that would be to consider NAC, alpha lipoic acid, a really powerful supplement. We might touch upon it, and cruciferous vegetables. And as I mentioned, reduce oxidative stress in your body, and that'll reduce the consumption of reduced glutathione and allow it to be more available.
Well, one of my most favorite recent episodes that you did on your show on YouTube, and please, everybody, please follow Dr. David Perlmutter. We'll link to his show in this podcast. You interviewed Dr. Ray Dorsey about his new book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, that he wrote with a few of his co-authors. And he talked about the importance of minimizing our exposure to things like air pollution, pesticides, as well as the dry cleaning chemical that I can't always pronounce, tetrachlorohydrin or something like that, and its sister chemical that is very similar that has not yet been banned, even though the first chemical has been banned. So living a lower toxin lifestyle to avoid developing, in his case, he's talking about Parkinson's disease. My guess is that those same things that would be contributing to the risk and likelihood of Parkinson's disease are also going to be making the body say ouch in other ways that could lead it to developing other neurodegenerative diseases, because they would be greatly depleting, glutathione levels as one aspect of, what was happening inside of the body. So two things. Number one, love that interview. Because of that, I ended up reaching out to Dr. Ray Dorsey and having him on the podcast. So thank you for that. And number two, just another reminder that we have to be vigilant and protect ourselves in this world that is, we're not always aware of how these things contribute in a massive way to our risk of decline later on in life.
Yeah, and oddly enough, in Neurology Reviews, which comes out, I guess, every month, and it's sort of a summary of the literature. And last night, I was reading exactly about this topic, and they made it very clear that it's a big concern beyond Parkinson's, that it may well relate to Alzheimer's. Why would we be surprised? And, not just these neurodegenerative conditions, but neurodevelopmental issues as well. So a threat to children, and, just how pervasive these chemicals are in our environment, that, you have them in your blood, as do I. And that's just because we live in the times in which we live. And, there are some that are still being manufactured, although that we hope it's going to be curtailed. They're called forever chemicals because they were developed to be pervasive and rather to be long-lived. It's, companies that made these chemicals years ago, and we got wonder products like Teflon and nonstick bags, paper bags, and plastics. There's a price to pay. And our immune systems, for example, are ill-equipped to deal with this onslaught of chemicals for which they are just, have never been exposed. And, we're seeing the consequences of this exposure. And I will say, Dr. Dorsey has been, it's been a challenge for him, because here he's, good science that he's producing and demonstrating these relationships between these exposures and risk for diseases for which we treat only the symptoms, i.e. Parkinson's. This relationship of environmental toxins and Parkinson's, it's something we've been talking about for at least 20 years, that pesticides, insecticides, for example, are Manib and Mancozeb, are used in experimental animal studies to create Parkinson's. And you can buy these chemicals on Amazon to put on your vegetable garden. I mean, there's something really wrong with that. What's wrong with this picture? So, it's true, though, that, people want their wonder products and really want to just turn away and live their lives. And but for those who care to listen, there are, beacons out there like Dr. Ray Dorsey who are making it very clear that, these are a clear and present danger for all of us.
We were chatting about the topic of supplementation. There were a few papers recently, and unfortunately I didn't bring them up, but I can link to them in the show notes, that were talking about the importance of a multivitamin, especially when it comes to lowering the risk of developing neurodegenerative disease in the future. Did you by any chance come across any of these papers?
In fact,
one in particular?
As you might expect, when something like that gets published, everybody puts it in my inbox so I don't miss it. And it wasn't a dramatic effect, but it was, and I've actually made some slides from that research. It was, not insignificant. And we talk about supplements being supplemental by definition. That means, you would have them as a supplement if you didn't have a good diet. Well, how do we define a good diet? We know that, for example, trace mineral levels in our vegetables these days, even organic ones, are not at the levels that we need in terms of things like copper and zinc and selenium and certainly magnesium. Therefore, if there's a sweet spot for each of these and so many other things in human nutrition, we're not reaching it. We're not at the mid part of the bell curve. And that's why supplements are important. So a multivitamin with minerals, I think, makes a lot of sense. And, the quality of those products is so highly variable. Some will say, well, we supply 100% of the RDA, the required daily allowance. That's not to me, that doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. There's certain areas that we really want to boost what we are taking as it relates to, for example, the B vitamins, magnesium, and certainly vitamin D. And a multivitamin will probably not contain DHA, for example. So we have to be a little bit more comprehensive in our messaging and in terms of what people are able to glean from what we're talking about in terms of then what they choose to do for themselves.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So just to kind of summarize that, and I did find the paper, it was shared in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition.
Right.
Yep. And it was the effects of multivitamin mineral supplementation versus placebo on cognitive function. And so if I'm understanding what you're talking about correctly, because so much percentage of the diet, especially here in America and increasingly exported to the rest of the world, is so low in trace minerals and other stuff, and just people are eating ultra processed foods. People are so deficient that even having a multivitamin could be pushing them in the right direction. But really, if we're paying attention,
yes. And this was an interventional placebo-controlled trial, and if you read the article, you realize that I think it was Centrum. I think it was a very inexpensive multivitamin, and which is great. Here the study proves that even this inexpensive multivitamin was able to bring about this difference in these individuals. Just think, that might indicate that perhaps stepping up the game a little bit in several areas that are included in multivitamin might get even a better result. Now, this was a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So think about the notion of a personalized approach to supplementation in an individual who wants to do the best for themselves in terms of brain health. And you are able to have the luxury of doing blood work to determine where that person is as it relates to B vitamin status, looking at things like homocysteine related to B vitamin status, looking at vitamin D levels, looking at essential fatty acid panels, for example, and then cultivate a unique program based upon that individual's needs, not just based upon their vitamin panels, but even looking at their genetic panels in terms of what their risks might be and how vitamins and other parts of supplementation might play into that. So, this was a very crude but powerful revelation that a relatively inexpensive multivitamin could have this effect.
Powerful. At the beginning of the interview, you were mentioning that there's a topic that we might get into, which was the idea of, if I understood correctly, like maybe therapeutics or other things that could be helpful or could be developed in the future. Does that ring a bell?
Sure does.
In terms of, okay, great. I'd love to just hand it over to you to talk about that and explain, what is it that you're thinking about, or what is it that you're potentially excited about that could be coming down the line?
Well, again, it circles back to our discussion on brain metabolism being front and center as it relates to what makes a good brain go bad. And that metabolism is really predicated, good metabolism, on insulin functionality and delivering glucose and other nutrients to the brain via the blood supply. So blood supply and insulin functionality are the central pillars of what I believe will ultimately be a powerful therapeutic intervention that will, I believe, help Alzheimer's patients. And the master regulator of the functionality of both those entities is nitric oxide. This gas, nitric oxide, that is produced in the body that regulates how insulin works and regulates blood flow. So I'm actually involved in research with a company called Brian Therapeutics, where we're using a validated pharmaceutical intervention that's already received FDA approval for utilization in another context. We're developing a trial where we're going to use virtually the same neurocognitive indices that have been used in the beta amyloid trials, apply the same ones over the same length of time in an interventional way. And in this case, not target beta amyloid, but target brain metabolism. And with the hope of at least showing parity with these drugs in terms of slowing cognitive decline. I think we're going to do better than that, though. I think we're going to, my hope is that we're going to have some pretty dramatic results. So that's what the future holds from my perspective in terms of finally approaching this problem from an interventional perspective as well as prevention.
Amazing. So it would be some type of drug that you would take that would help increase or maintain higher levels of nitric oxide inside of the body?
That's right.
That's the hope.
We've already seen this prove its merit in treating COVID and also in cardiovascular disease. So, it's basically repurposing and seeing where we go with this. And I'm very, very excited about it.
Beautiful. Well, I can't wait to hear, how all that goes, and we'll have you back on to talk about it at that point in time. That's very exciting. Dr. Perlmutter, as we're winding down here with our time together, I asked my community, what are their sort of questions they have for you that I would bring up in sort of our hot takes portion of the conversation. And so there is a few questions that I have here, and I'll jump right into the first one. There is a trend on YouTube in particular where a lot of people are championing essentially quitting coffee. And they're promising miraculous benefits that would happen to the body and sometimes even the brain if somebody quits coffee for 30 days, 60 days, and potentially beyond. I'd love for you to chime in on the thoughts about coffee, how you use it, and any kind of recommendations that you would have, and if there's any truth to this idea that people should be considering, quitting coffee.
Well, there's two sides to that discussion, and I think that there are downsides. And I think there are coffees on the market that are infested with mold. I think people tend to overdo coffee in terms of having too much caffeine, and especially later in the day, such that their sleep might be dysfunctional. And we certainly unpacked that topic at length. I think it's important to recognize that caffeine, as part of the coffee discussion, though there are 90 or more bioactive constituents of coffee that have generally, positive effects on health, including chlorogenic acid. But, understand that caffeine has a half-life in the human body of 6 hours. So if you have a double espresso at 3:00 in the afternoon, it's just early afternoon, I should be fine. At 9:00, 6 hours later, half that caffeine is still in your body. So it's like you just had an espresso at 9 p.m. So I think some of the bad rap that coffee is getting comes from its effects on our chronobiology when used inappropriately. So, I think the notion of a caffeine curfew beyond coffee, tea, whatever it may be, Red Bull, Coke, you name it, so chocolate, whatever caffeine source there is, I think the notion of a caffeine curfew is really important, that you don't have caffeine in the afternoon. For me, it's, 2:00 is the cutoff. I think that significant issues can happen when people don't have adequate sleep because of their misuse of coffee. I drink 1.5 cups or at times 2 cups in the morning. I enjoy the heck out of it. And there's something to be said about the fact that I enjoy the heck out of anything, that a person derives pleasure from something, I guess within reason. And to be clear, there is something called decaf coffee that is out there that has pretty much the entire spectrum of health benefits in relationship to caffeinated coffee, provided that the caffeine has been removed in a water bath type of distillation process that removes the caffeine and doesn't use chemicals to make that happen. So I vote for a third-party, mold-free, organic, regenerative agriculture produced type of coffee. That's what I drink. That's what I travel with. And I'm willing to hear both sides of this discussion. I didn't say argument, I said discussion.
Thank you for that. All right. The next question that we have here is that with so much more emphasis, even since the last time that we've had you on the podcast, there's been so much more individuals talking about prioritizing protein and the importance of getting enough protein as primarily a byproduct of maintaining healthy muscle mass, especially as we age 40, 50, 60, and beyond. And how muscle is an important part of maintaining protection for our bones, but also strong metabolic health as we age. What is your thoughts on the protein discussion is an individual asking, and have you changed your mind at all over the years in terms of how much protein you are prioritizing on getting in your own diet?
First, I'll say I do consume more protein now than before. And it is exactly because of what you mentioned. I want to maintain muscle mass. So I consume more protein. And I also consume creatine monohydrate, and I'm using a topical testosterone gel, all designed to increase or preserve muscle mass. I think one of the worst things that we can do is threaten one of our most important endocrine glands in the body. Now, which endocrine gland am I talking about? Is it the thyroid? Is it the pancreas? Is it the pituitary gland? No, it's the muscles. And I think for your viewers, that may raise some eyebrows. Well, what is an endocrine gland? An endocrine gland is a part of the body that secretes a chemical that has functionality elsewhere in the body. And as it relates to the muscles do exactly that and should be considered, therefore, endocrine glands. Muscles create a variety of chemicals like interleukin-6 and lactate and ketones and irisin, cathepsin B, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Those are some of the chemicals produced by muscle that have distant effects. Now, in fact, everything I just mentioned has an effect within the brain. As it relates to interleukin-6 directly stimulates a very important metabolic pathway in our body called AMP kinase. And AMP kinase is what allows us to have adequate metabolism, to burn fat as a fuel, to make less blood sugar, to stimulate the growth of new mitochondria in our cells, including in the brain and in the muscle. So I think, for people to say, oh, well, Dr. Perlmutter, you said something different 5 years ago, and now you're saying you've changed your messaging. Yep. And 5 years ago, I'll probably tell you something different. Who knows? I hope that I do. Because science changes. And I think our understanding, this notion of the muscles as an endocrine gland and, our studying of all of the things related to muscle called the myokinome is relatively new. And as such, there is, suddenly this surge of interest in muscle and preventing at all costs sarcopenia or wasting of muscles, which typifies growing older. So, I'm 69, and as we age, it's more and more difficult to preserve muscle mass. I have to exercise more, and I have to spend more time lifting weights. And I've done those other things like the creatine, the higher levels of protein, and using topical testosterone, for example. So I think that things are changing with time, and I think the notion of having about a gram or 0.8 to a gram of protein per day per pound of ideal body weight makes sense.
Fantastic. Thank you for that breakdown, that clarification, and may we all evolve with our own thoughts in a way that, benefits our life and the lives of people around us, right? That's why we're all here. All right. Last question I have here. It's in
the lightning round.
Yeah. The last question in the lightning round.
Double point value. So there you go.
It's true. It's true. Can you ask Dr. David Perlmutter, what is something, no matter how big or small, that has had the biggest impact on his health in the last year? Something big, something small that's had the biggest impact on your health in the last year. And biggest can be relative to you. And it doesn't have to be a supplement. It doesn't have to necessarily be a food. It could be community. It could be this.
All right, I'm going to give it an answer, and it's a bit of a surprise answer.
Okay, give it to us.
So I learned... and I experienced atrial fibrillation. Went to a cardiologist, and he said that. Well, he asked me. He said, "Let me guess. We see it in NBA basketball players and long distance runners." And he looked at me and he said, probably not NBA, long distance running. I said, yeah, because I was a long distance runner for years and years. I mean, I would still do it. But now I realize that's what gave me occasional events of atrial fibrillation. So the biggest event was I had a procedure, which was called a cardiac ablation procedure, where this cardiologist went in and found the genesis in my heart for the atrial fibrillation, and he froze it. And gosh, God, that might have been close to a year ago now. I think it was last spring, and I've been perfect since then. So that's the biggest health event that I've had to experience, and I think that's probably a surprise answer. People say, "Well, I started taking XYZ." There are a couple of XYZs I've added to the program, and I might go for that. I've added a new probiotic called Akkermansia. I think there's a lot of good data behind it. I've increased my quercetin consumption it might take some time to unpack why I did that. And I think from that perspective, supplement perspective, probably nothing else really dramatic. I'm using a lot of allulose as a sweetener. We see that allulose is what we call a GLP-1 agonist, so it acts in very favorable ways in the human body to help control blood sugar. There you go.
Going back to the AFib, and for anybody not familiar, essentially an abnormal heartbeat, heart rhythm. What was your understanding of long distance running and how that contributes to individuals developing AFib?
I don't know the mechanism. It probably has to do with perhaps dilatation of the heart, of the atria, and probably maybe even of the aorta and the superior vena cava as well. It's hard to say, but there's a strong relationship between endurance athletes and the development of atrial fibrillation. So, I felt like, well, I'm in good company, but he said, your heart is great, but we'll fix it. And, I may have mentioned that I live on a boat for 4 months a year when we're really far away from anything. And the cardiologist said to me something I'll never forget. He said, listen, what happens to you when you're on the boat away from anybody, just you and your wife, and you go into AFib? What are you going to do? I said, sign me up for the ablation. And I was in the hospital the next week and left. And gosh, he said, I'll give you an 80% likelihood that this will be curative. And it was. I'm really, really happy.
Incredible. Hats off to modern medicine and all the beautiful things that it brings to the table. Dr. David Perlmutter, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Would love to just give a shout out to your show, which we have a link to in the show notes. You have incredible interviews, especially a bunch of them on YouTube that I found, just incredibly fascinating. And I've gotten excited and booked some of those same guests on my own podcast because I saw your interview with them. And then also you and your team were part of a docuseries that occasionally launches, here and there. People can stay tuned to it. Would you mind mentioning the website of where people could go to find out more about?
There's a new one that's actually being shown right now, and it's called the Better Brain Blueprint.
Yeah, so we're sending it out to our list.
Yeah, that's our latest summit, as it were, and it's the response has been over the top. I mean, it's been really, really helpful. So. I'll get you that information. Better Brain Blueprint.
Yeah, thebetterbrainblueprint.com. And if you wouldn't just mind, who should watch this new series that's available?
I would say the only people who should watch it are people who have a vowel in their names. So that could be anybody. Ask yourself, if you have a vowel in your first or last name, you should watch this summit.
Well, if you want a better brain, that's what you should check out. We have links to Dr. David Perlmutter's Instagram, social media, etc., where he posts fantastic information. And again, David, thank you for being on the podcast today and reminding. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to have you on. And thanks for reminding us that there is a lot that we can do to protect our brain as we age.
You bet.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
It's pretty easy to take even a stage 4 cancer and get it to go away. But then if you don't change the person's chemistry, let's say, lifestyle, the same environment that's set up for that cancer, it's going to come back.